Before we begin, drop in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is there. By the end of this, you will understand why that detail matters. There are figures in Appalachian history that the surrounding community understood long before any outside authority arrived to make an official determination. The mountains produced a particular kind of knowledge in the people who lived inside, them a slow accumulated, observational intelligence born from years of watching the same hollows, the same ridgelines, the same faces at the same distances. When that intelligence turned its attention toward a person and arrived at a conclusion, the conclusion was rarely wrong. It was simply, in many cases, arrived at too late. The case of Marin Holst of Sevier County, Tennessee, is one of those cases. What the families of the Cades Mill community understood about the widow on Broken Fork Ridge, and how long they understood it before they were able to do anything about it, is a record of what isolation does to the machinery of ordinary human accountability. By the time the Sevier County Sheriff's Office sent a deputy up that ridge in the November of 1922, 4 families in the surrounding hollows had already known for the better part of a year that something on that ridge was not right. They had known it the way mountain people know things, not from a document, not from an authority, but from what they had seen with their own eyes at the tree line before dawn in the cold. Tell me where you are watching from. You will want to know you are somewhere with neighbors close. The Tennessee Appalachians in Sevier County in 1922 were not accessible country by any standard of the period outside the mountains themselves. The valley roads were maintained, barely, by county labor gangs that worked the main routes between Sevierville and the smaller settlements through the spring and summer months and abandoned them to the frost and the runoff come October. Above the valley floor, there were no maintained roads at all. There were wagon tracks, some of them graded by the logging companies that had been cutting the ridge timber since the 1890s, and there were footpaths that the mountain families had worn into the ridgelines over generations of daily use. But a path is not a road, and in Sevier County in 1922, the distance between a hollow community and the nearest town was measured not in miles but in hours of difficult terrain, and in winter in days. The nearest doctor was in Sevierville. The nearest telegraph was in Sevierville. The law, in any practical sense, was in Sevierville. Whatever happened on the ridges above Cades Mill happened in a world that the county seat did not reach into unless it was specifically requested to do so, and the mountain families who had managed their own affairs for 4 generations did not request it easily or often. Marin Holst had come to Broken Fork Ridge as a bride in 1901 at the age of 19, marrying a Norwegian-descended timber worker named Petter Holst, who had settled the Upper Ridge property a decade before her arrival. She was tall for a woman of her generation, within an inch of 6 feet by the later account of Clara Babb, whose family worked the hollow directly below the Holst property, and who had known Marin for the better part of 20 years. A frame that had been lean in her youth and had grown angular through 2 decades of mountain work, shoulders that were broad for a woman, hands that Clara Babbride described as longer than seemed right, the fingers, like they'd been stretched by the work. Her eyes were a pale gray that people who knew her consistently described by comparison to overcast sky, not threatening in color, but without warmth. She moved quietly. That was the detail most frequently noted by the Cades Mill families in the accounts collected by Deputy Harlan Webb of the Sevier County Sheriff's Office in November of 1922, that for a large woman, she moved through the woods with an absence of sound that struck people as wrong, though no one could have said exactly when they first noticed it or when it crossed from unusual into disturbing. Petter Holst died in the spring of 1919, a logging accident on the upper ridge, a cable snap during a skidding operation, the kind of accident that the ridge logging crews experienced with grim regularity, the kind that filled the Sevier County death records of that period with the names of men between 25 and 50 who had been reduced by a moment of mechanical failure to something that could not be recovered intact. He was 44 years old. He left Marin the ridge property, a small timber lease that was nearly played out, a mule and a larder that would need to be supplemented by her own industry to carry her through the winter. She had no children. She had no family in the county. She had, by all accounts of the surrounding community, managed the 3 years between Petter's death and the autumn of 1922 with a self-sufficiency that the Cades Mill families initially found admirable, in the way that mountain communities admire anyone who does not ask for help they are not owed. For the first year after Petter's death, nothing seemed unusual. She was known as a woman who kept her own company, who appeared in Cades Mill perhaps twice in a season to trade dried goods at the Babb family store, who spoke carefully and briefly and returned up the ridge before the afternoon light dropped. People said she was private but capable, the way mountain communities talk about widows who manage without complaint. The first sign came in the late winter of 1921. A 12-year-old boy named Ellis Cutshaw, whose family worked a small corn plot and trap line in the hollow immediately east of the Holst Ridge property, told his mother one morning in February that he had seen the widow standing at the tree line above their garden plot before dawn, not walking, not moving through the trees in the ordinary way of someone crossing from one property to another, standing. At the edge of the tree line where the cleared land of the Cutshaw plot met the first rank of hardwoods in the dark before first light, completely still. He had seen her from his bedroom window and had watched her for several minutes before she turned and went back into the trees. His mother, a practical woman named Ruth Cutshaw, walked up to the tree line that morning and examined the ground where her son said the widow had been standing. The ground was soft from recent snowmelt. There were prints. They were the prints of a large-footed woman, narrow at the heel and long at the toe, pressed deep into the soft earth in a way that suggested the figure had been standing in the same position for a considerable time. Ruth Cutshaw noted this. She told her husband. They did not report it to anyone outside the immediate family. People stood at tree lines for their own reasons. It was not a crime to stand at a tree line, and then the Cutshaw traps started coming up empty. Not disturbed, not robbed by another trapper, which would have left the traps sprung or the mechanisms tampered with. Empty. The animals that should have been in them were not. This went on for 6 days across the stretch of the Cutshaw line that ran closest to the Holst property boundary. On the 7th day, Ellis Cutshaw's father, a man named George, went to check the line himself and found something that he brought home and set on the kitchen table and looked at for a long time without speaking. It was a small animal, a muskrat that had been removed from one of his traps. It had not been removed carelessly, the way a scavenging animal removes a catch, leaving damage and disorder. It had been removed with a precision that left the trap itself perfectly intact and reset, and the animal itself was unmarked except for the trap injury, as though it had been taken for examination rather than consumption, looked at, and then left on the ground beside the trap. He found 3 more in the same condition along that stretch of line over the following week, set aside, studied, returned. He did not go to the constable. He went to his neighbor James Babb, whose family store served as the informal clearinghouse for community information in Cades Mill. What James Babb told him, quietly and with evident discomfort, was that the Cutshaws were not the only family with something to report. The Sexton family, whose property ran along the western face of the Holst Ridge, had been watching the widow for 2 months. She had been seen at their tree line. She had been seen standing at the upper edge of their cleared land in the early morning hours, not once but on 4 separate occasions across January and February. Their eldest son, a 22-year-old named Roy, had walked up to the tree line one morning after seeing her there, and had found, in the place where she had been standing, a pattern in the leaf litter that he could not account for, a circular clearing approximately 4 feet across, where the leaves had been methodically moved aside to expose the bare soil beneath. The soil in the center of that circle had been disturbed. Something had been pressed into it. Roy Sexton could not identify what. He covered it over and went back down the hill and did not sleep easily for a week. The fog settled back into the hollows that evening. The trees held still. The ridge above Cades Mill had nothing to say. It was James Babb who finally sent word down to Sevierville in October of 1922. Not a formal complaint, a letter delivered by a Cades Mill man who was making the trip to town for winter supplies, addressed to the Sevier County Sheriff's Office, stating that there was a widow on Broken Fork Ridge whose behavior over the preceding year had produced significant concern among the surrounding families and requesting that a deputy make the ride up to assess the situation. The letter, which Deputy Harlan Webb referenced in his case report filed November 14, 1922, a document preserved in the Sevier County Courthouse records in the bound ledger of miscellaneous civil and criminal matters for that year, described in plain language what the Cutshaw and Sexton families had observed. Webb rode up to Broken Fork Ridge on November 9, 1922. He was 31 years old, a Sevier County man himself, not easily unsettled by mountain conditions or mountain people. He had grown up 40 miles from that ridge. He knew the terrain and he knew the culture, and he arrived, by his own account in his report, expecting to find an eccentric and isolated widow and to return to Sevierville before dark with nothing requiring further action. He did not return before dark. The Holst property at the top of Broken Fork Ridge was a 2-room log structure with a stone chimney and a small outbuilding that had served as a tool and feed store during Petter Holst's working years. Webb arrived at mid-morning. Maren Holst was not in the cabin. He waited. When she came out of the tree line to the north of the property an hour later, she was carrying a cloth bundle that she shifted to her left arm when she saw him. In a movement he described in his report as unhurried and deliberate, the movement of a woman who had seen a stranger on her property and was not startled but was making a decision, He identified himself. She invited him inside. He accepted. What Deputy Webb documented from his examination of the Holst cabin and from his conversation with Marin Holst over the course of that afternoon was divided in his report into two sections. The first section described the interior of the cabin, which he noted was orderly and maintained in a way consistent with a self-sufficient household, with one exception. In the back room, the sleeping room, on a shelf above the small iron stove, were arranged a series of objects that Webb inventoried carefully. 17 items in total. Small objects: a child's wooden button, a man's tobacco pipe with a cracked stem, a woman's hairpin of a style that had been fashionable perhaps 20 years prior, 3 coins of various denominations, a strip of cloth that appeared to have been cut from a work shirt, and 11 other small personal objects of the kind that accumulate in a life but are not acquired intentionally. Webb noted in his report that the arrangement was deliberate, each object separated from the next by an even interval, each positioned with its most identifiable feature facing outward, as though for inspection rather than storage. He asked Marin Holst about them. She said they were things she had found on the ridge and in the hollows over the years. Found things, she said. The woods were full of what people left behind. Webb's second section addressed the conversation itself. He asked her about the families below, about whether she had been on their land. She said she walked the ridge and the hollows, as she always had, as Petter had, as the property boundary allowed. She said she had not done anything that was not permitted by the customs of the mountain. Her answers were complete and calm and produced, in Webb, a discomfort he was careful to document without overstating. He wrote, "She answered every question directly, and I could find no falsehood in the answers, but I did not feel, at the conclusion of the interview, that I had learned what I came to learn." He noted the pale eyes. He noted the stillness. He noted that when he stood to leave and she walked him to the door, the light was already going from the ridge, and in the last of it she watched him from the cabin doorway until he reached the first rank of trees on the path down, and he did not hear the door close behind him until he was well into the trees and no longer able to see the cabin. He did not enter the outbuilding. He later stated in a supplemental note added to the case file in December of 1922 that he had intended to and had not, and that he was not able to identify a specific reason for the omission that he was satisfied with. A second deputy rode up to the Holst property in December of 1922, following a formal complaint submitted by George Cutshaw after his youngest daughter told him she had seen the widow at the tree line again, standing in the dark before first light twice in the same week. The second deputy, whose name appears in the record only as T. Llewellyn, attempted to inspect the outbuilding. It was locked. Marin Holst said she had lost the key. Llewellyn noted in his addendum to the case file that the outbuilding's single window had been covered from the inside with a material he could not identify through the gap at the window's edge, and that there was a smell from the structure that he described in his report, briefly and without elaboration, as not right for a tool store. He made no further entry on the subject. The Sevier County Sheriff's case file on Marin Holst of Broken Fork Ridge was closed in January of 1923, with a notation that no actionable evidence of criminal conduct had been established and that the matter was resolved pending further complaint. No further complaint was submitted, not because the watching stopped, because in the spring of 1923 the Cutshaw family left the hollow. The Sexton family followed by summer. The Babb store in Cades Mill operated for 2 more seasons and then closed when there were not enough customers remaining to sustain it. By 1925, the community that had existed below Broken Fork Ridge for 4 generations had dispersed, quietly and without formal explanation, into other hollows and other counties. Marin Holst remained on the ridge. The 1930 federal census lists her as the sole resident of the Broken Fork Ridge area of Sevier County. Age given 48, occupation none listed. She does not appear in the 1940 census. She does not appear in any death record in the Sevier County files. She is not in any county burial record. After 1930, the official record of Marin Holst of Broken Fork Ridge simply stops, the way a path stops when the land that made it necessary has been abandoned. The ridge property today is within the boundary of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, absorbed into federal land management during the park's expansion in the 1930s. The cabin structure is gone, collapsed and reclaimed. The outbuilding foundation is still visible in satellite survey imagery of that section of the ridge, a rectangular depression in the ground cover at the coordinates consistent with the Holst property plat. Park Service trails do not route through that section of the ridge. There is no listed reason. Here is what the record of the Cades Mill families ultimately asks. 4 families watched a woman at their tree lines before dawn for the better part of 2 years. They found what she left behind. They knew in the particular and unspoken way that isolated communities accumulate knowledge about the people inside them that what was happening on that ridge was wrong, and then, one by one, they left rather than remain close to it. Was that the right response? The rational response of people who understood something that the law's 2 visits had failed to reach? Or does the abandonment of the hollow mean that whatever Maren Holst was doing on Broken Fork Ridge, whatever was in that outbuilding, whatever she was collecting from the families below her, was simply left in place, unexamined and unresolved, when the last wagon rolled out of Cade's mill? The ridge kept what it was given. It has not offered it back. What do you believe Maren Holst was? A disturbed and isolated woman whose grief had curdled into something predatory, or something that the mountain had made of her over 20 years of solitude, that does not fit any category we are comfortable naming? Drop your answer below. If these accounts, the documented ones, the ones with case file numbers and census records and names that you can verify, are what you want to keep finding, subscribe and ring the bell. We have more of them. None of them are comfortable. Stay out of the tree line before dawn, and if you see something standing there that isn't moving, do not go to the window a second time.